The vibrations in the earth told John Mason everything he needed to know. 12 motorcycles approaching his farm from the North Road. His calloused fingers traced the familiar wood of his father's old rocking chair as he sat motionless on his porch. Beside him, Shadow, his German shepherd, remained silent but alert. The bikers thought they'd found an easy target, a blind farmer, alone on 200 acres of Montana soil. They'd already run 3 families off their land this month, but they didn't know about the sniper who'd recorded 317 confirmed kills across 4 combat zones. They couldn't see the man who'd learned to shoot by sound and instinct alone after losing his sight. They were about to learn why some wounded warriors never stop being dangerous. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn arrived with a symphony John Mason had learned to read like sheet music. The soft whisper of wheat stalks dancing in the morning breeze, winds from the northwest, good weather coming, crickets still chirping their night songs while early. Birds began their morning chorus, no predators nearby. The subtle creak of his barn's old timbers settling, temperature rising, another warm day ahead. Shadow's claws clicked against the hardwood floor inside, approaching with the measured pace that meant breakfast time. The German shepherd's routine was as precise as any military operation, something John had come to rely on in the 4 years since losing his sight. "Ready for rounds, boy?" John asked, reaching down to feel Shadow's muscular shoulder. The dog's tail thumped against his leg, once, twice, their own private code. Together, they stepped out onto the porch, John's boots finding each familiar board without hesitation. The farm had been his salvation after the explosion that took his sight. While other wounded veterans struggled to find purpose, John had discovered that farming engaged every sense, except the one he'd lost. His fingers could read soil composition better than any moisture meter. His ears caught subtle changes in engine sounds that warned of equipment problems before they became serious. Living blind had taught him that most people relied too heavily on their eyes, missing the wealth of information their other senses provided. He'd learned to feel the difference between healthy and diseased plants by touch, to smell approaching rain hours before it fell, to hear the subtle changes in wind that warned of storms. Shadow guided him along their morning route, but John hardly needed the help anymore. Every step was mapped in his mind with sniper's precision. 30 paces to the barn, turn 15 degrees east, 12 more to the tractor. His military training had given him skills that translated surprisingly well to blind farming. Attention to detail, precise mental mapping, and above all, patience. The farm's 100-year-old bell rang out, 6 a.m., right on schedule. Martha, his housekeeper since his return, was reliable as sunrise. She'd been his brother's high school sweetheart before Danny was killed in Fallujah, and now she helped John maintain the family legacy. Her footsteps approached, bringing the smell of coffee and fresh-baked bread. "Breakfast's ready," she called. "And Tommy Jenkins called about helping with the harvest next week." John nodded, turning his face toward her voice. "Good. Boy needs work more than he needs trouble. His father said he's been running with a rough crowd in town." Speaking of trouble, Martha's voice carried a note of concern. "Sheriff Burke called. Says there's a motorcycle club moved into the old Miller place, been causing problems up near Chester." John's fingers tightened slightly on Shadow's harness. "What kind of problems?" "Intimidation mostly, trying to pressure farmers into selling cheap. Burke says they're organized, not your typical troublemakers." John absorbed this information with the same tactical awareness that had once helped him. Analyze battlefield intelligence, location, timing, methodology. Everything told a story if you knew how to read it. "They'll work their way down here eventually," he said quietly. "They always do." Martha's breath caught slightly. She'd seen that expression before, the one that reminded her John Mason wasn't just a blind farmer. "Don't go borrowing trouble," she said. Maybe they'll pass us by. John smiled, but it didn't reach his sightless eyes. Maybe. Shadow, barn. The German shepherd led him away, their steps precise and measured. Inside the barn, John's fingers found the hidden panel behind old feed sacks. The false wall opened silently, revealing a space he hadn't accessed since coming home. His hands moved over familiar shapes, custom rifle components, specialized ammunition, communication equipment. He'd stored them away, hoping never to need them again, but experience had taught him it was better to be prepared. The world thought blindness had made him vulnerable, but in many ways it had made him more dangerous. What good were darkness or camouflage against a man who fought by sound and touch? He closed the panel, locking away both weapons and memories. For now. Shadow's ears pricked suddenly, catching a sound too distant for human hearing. John cocked his head, focusing. Motorcycles far off but approaching. Not on the main road, using the old logging trail. Scouting. "Easy, boy," he murmured, scratching Shadow's ear. "Not today, but soon." The memories always came strongest at night. John sat in his father's rocking chair, listening to the evening crickets, while his mind drifted back to another darkness, one filled with gunfire and radio chatter. Target confirmed, 1700 meters, at just 2 degrees for wind. His spotter's voice, calm and precise. The Taliban commander had thought himself safe behind 3 layers of security. But distance meant nothing to a man who could read wind patterns in the way dust moved across mountain ridges. 1 shot, 1 kill. Number 316. The last clear image John would ever see came the next day. A blinding flash as the IED detonated. He remembered the searing heat, the feeling of being thrown backward. The medics said he was lucky. The blast could have killed him. Instead, it only took his sight. Recovery was hell. The doctors talked about adaptation, rehabilitation, learning to live with disability. But they didn't understand that a blind sniper was a contradiction in terms. Or so he thought. It was Master Sergeant Chen who changed everything. The old martial arts instructor visited him in the hospital, listened to his despair, then asked one question. "Do you think your eyes were what made you deadly?" Chen began training him that same day. A sniper's true weapons, he taught, are patience, awareness, and understanding. The shot is just the final act. They started with sound, learning to track movement by footsteps, to judge distance by echo, to read terrain through ambient noise. Then touch, feeling air currents, detecting vibrations through surfaces, understanding the subtle changes that indicated movement. "Your other senses were always this sharp," Chen explained. "You just never needed them when you had sight. Now they'll become your eyes." The training was brutal. Hours of listening exercises, tracking moving targets by sound alone, learning to build complete mental maps of his environment. But slowly, impossibly, it worked. His last qualification test came 9 months after losing his sight. They set him up on a range with 5 targets at unknown distances. Using only sound and wind sense, he put 5 rounds into 5 targets. Not center mass. Those days were gone, but kill shots nonetheless. "Sight is a crutch most people lean on too heavily," Chen told him afterward. "You've learned to walk without it. That makes you more dangerous, not less." But John knew his combat days were over. He returned home to the family farm, a place his other senses remembered perfectly. His father had passed while he was deployed, leaving him sole owner of land that had been in the Mason family for 3 generations. The farm became his new mission. Every fence post, every building, every path, he mapped them all, building a mental terrain model as detailed as any battlefield survey. Shadow came next, a retired military working dog who understood commands in 4 languages and could spot a threat at 300 meters. Together, they developed new techniques. Shadow learned to give silent signals through body pressure and subtle movements. John learned to read the dog's reactions through the harness, understanding complex information from the slightest muscle tension. The nightmares gradually faded, replaced by dreams of wheat fields and gentle rains. But he never stopped practicing the skills Chen had taught him. Every morning he ran drills, tracking Martha's movement through the house by sound, identifying vehicles by their engine noise, locating objects thrown randomly in the yard. "Always be ready," Chen had said. "Not because you expect trouble, but because trouble expects you to be helpless." In the distance, a motorcycle engine growled, closer this time using the county road. Shadow's muscles tensed slightly against John's leg. The bikers were doing recon, learning the area, planning something. John had seen it before, in another life, watching enemy forces probe defenses. He reached down to stroke Shadow's head, feeling the subtle tremor of alertness in the dog's frame. "I know, boy," he whispered. "They think blindness makes us weak. Let them think that, for now." The skills that had made him the military's deadliest sniper hadn't vanished with his sight. They'd evolved, adapted, become something new. The darkness that had seemed like an ending had become a different kind of weapon. Number 317 had been his last official kill, but somehow he knew it wouldn't be his last shot. John's day began like a military operation, with precision born from years of practice. At 05:00 a.m., Shadow's cold nose pressed against his hand. First alarm. The house's heating system clicked on at 05:10 a.m. Second alarm. Martha's car would pull up at 05:30 a.m., the gravel crunching in a pattern he'd learned to recognize from all other vehicles. "Time for perimeter check," he told Shadow, who was already moving into position. The morning inspection was more than habit. It was intelligence gathering. His enhanced hearing picked up everything from loose fence wires to equipment problems by their changed sounds. Today, something was different. The wire fence along the north property line vibrated wrongly when he touched it. "Show me," he commanded. Shadow. The dog led him along the fence until they found it. Fresh cuts, amateur work. Someone had been testing their security. "Martha," he called as she approached. "We've got visitors." Her footsteps stopped. "How can you tell? Wire's been cut and rehung. Probably last night. They're looking for weak points." His fingers traced the metal. 3 cuts, each about 2 feet apart. Testing response time. The bikers? Yeah. Getting bolder. He mentally mapped the damaged section, 50 yards from the north gate near the old oak tree. Good cover there for watchers. They were professionals, or at least had professional training. Inside his workshop, John moved with the same precision that had once guided his shots. Every tool had its place, memorized by touch and distance. A blind man couldn't afford disorder. It could be lethal in either military or civilian life. The farm machinery responded to touch and sound in ways most sighted people missed. A bad bearing in the tractor announced itself through vibration, long before it would become visible damage. Soil conditions could be read through resistance against the plow blade. Even the wheat spoke to him. Healthy stalks had a different sound in the wind than diseased ones. "Tommy's here," Martha called from outside. John heard the boy's nervous shuffle. 17, trying to act tough but scared of the blind farmer. "Good instincts, that kid. North fence needs repair," John said. "Show him how, Martha. And Tommy, pay attention to any motorcycle tracks you see up there." The boy's heartbeat kicked up, so he knew something. "Yes, sir. Saw 3 of them. Watching the farm yesterday. From the ridge." John nodded slowly. They were establishing surveillance points, standard procedure before an operation. "Good eye, Tommy. Keep noting details like that." His fingers found the hidden compartment in his workbench. Inside, his custom rifle parts waited. He'd cleaned them weekly for 4 years, muscle memory keeping his skills sharp. The metal felt cool, familiar, like greeting an old friend. Shadow's subtle shift in posture alerted him seconds before Martha's return. "Tommy's working on the fence. John—" She hesitated. "Sheriff Burke called again. Miller family's pulling out." Said they got visited last night. 3 broken windows and a clear message. Sell or worse would follow. John's hands kept moving over his tools, but his mind was calculating distances, angles, escape routes. The Miller farm was 4 miles north. Response time for sheriff's deputies, 15 minutes minimum. Time for bikers to reach his farm from there, 6 minutes by road, 10 by trail. Martha, I need you to do something. Don't ask why. He pulled a key from his pocket. Storage unit in town, number 217. Inside there's a case marked irrigation supplies. Bring it here. John. Her voice carried worry, memory. She'd seen what happened when Danny went to war. Now she was watching another Mason prepare for battle. It's just preparation, he assured her. But they both knew better. The rhythms of peace were giving way to the rhythms of war. He could feel it in the earth, hear it in the wind, sense it in Shadow's increasing alertness. They thought blindness made him vulnerable. But you didn't survive 4 combat tours, didn't become the military's most lethal sniper by relying on just your eyes. He'd learned long ago that true vision came from using every sense, every instinct. The bikers were coming. They'd bring violence and think themselves wolves among sheep. But they'd learn what others had learned too late, sometimes. The deadliest predators are the ones you never see coming. The motorcycles approached like distant thunder, growing from a low rumble into a deliberate roar. John counted them by sound. 8 bikes, heavy cruisers, modified exhausts. They were announcing themselves, wanting to be heard, wanting to intimidate. Shadow's muscles tensed against his leg, but John kept his hand gentle on the dog's head. Easy, boy. Let's hear what they have to say first. The bikes pulled into his driveway in formation, another sign of organization that triggered his tactical awareness. The engines cut off in sequence, not all at once. Military precision poorly disguised as casual behavior. Nice spread you got here, old man. The leader's voice carried artificial friendliness over steel, heavy boots on gravel moving with purpose. Shame about your eyes. Must be hard working all this land blind. John rocked slowly in his chair, facing the voice with practiced accuracy. I manage. Sure you do. A lighter clicked. Expensive, Zippo by the sound. The leader was closer now, 8 feet away, slightly to the left. 4 others had moved to flank the porch, trying to be subtle about it. The remaining 3 stayed with the bikes, engines still hot enough to tick as they cooled. But you got to think about the future. Accidents happen, especially to blind men living alone. Martha's car was approaching from town. He could hear her distinctive engine. Shadow's ears twitched, but John scratched them gently. Not yet. That a threat? John kept his voice mild, curious. Let them think him naive. Leather creaked as the leader leaned against the porch rail. Call it community outreach. Valley's changing. Progress, you might say. Smart folks are selling while the market's good. Like the Millers? John asked. He felt the subtle shift in the air as the leader tensed. Heard they had some accidents, broken windows, funny kind of progress, funny kind of blind man. One of the flankers muttered, sees more than he should. The leader's voice hardened. Don't need eyes to see the writing on the wall, old-timer. We're offering fair price now. Tomorrow, next week, who knows what your farm might be worth then. Martha's car turned into the driveway. John heard her brake suddenly. Heard her door open. John? Everything okay? Fine, Martha. He kept his face toward the leader. Just some gentlemen discussing. Progress, lady, the leader called out, false charm back in place. Maybe you can help your employer see reason. Be a shame if he got hurt trying to keep up this place alone. John heard Martha's steps on the gravel, measured and unafraid. Mr. Mason owns this land free and clear. He's not interested in selling. Everyone's interested in selling. Bootsteps on his porch now, heavy with menace. Just a matter of proper motivation, Shadow growled, low and dangerous. John felt the dog's muscles bunch, ready to launch. Your dog seems upset. the leader observed. Accidents happen to dogs too. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as John's face changed. Gone was the pleasant blind farmer. Something colder, harder, showed through, just for a moment. That would be unwise, he said quietly. His voice carried something that made the leader step back involuntarily. Very unwise. Silence stretched for 3 heartbeats, then forced laughter. Just having a friendly chat. Think about our offer. We'll be back tomorrow for an answer. Engines started up, revved aggressively. The bikes pulled out in formation, their thunder receding toward town. But John kept his hand on Shadow, listening intently. 2 stayed behind, he told Martha once the others were gone. Watching from the oak grove. Tell Tommy to take the south road home. John... Martha's voice shook slightly. What are we going to do? His fingers found the porch rail, felt the fresh scars where the leader's rings had scraped the wood. I'm going to give them their answer, just not the one they're expecting. In the distance, a bike's engine gunned, a signal to the watchers. John's unseeing eyes turned toward the sound, his face set in lines of deadly determination. They thought. They were hunting a blind farmer. Tomorrow they'd learn what it meant to become the prey. Night fell like a velvet curtain, but darkness meant nothing to John Mason. He sat motionless in his workshop, listening to the 2 bikers who thought they were being stealthy near his north fence. Their whispered conversation carried clearly. To his trained ears, Boss says, watch the blind man, make sure he doesn't try leaving before tomorrow's meeting. The first voice, young and nervous, just keep eyes on the house, come morning he'll sell or things get ugly. Second voice, older, more confident. Both were smoking, cheap cigarettes, the smell carried on the wind. John's fingers moved over. The reassembled rifle components, not his sniper weapon, not yet. Just a standard hunting rifle, modified for his current needs. Shadow lay silent at his feet, waiting. Time to explain some things to our guests, John whispered. The dog rose silently, padding to the door. They moved like ghosts through the darkness, John's feet finding each step with perfect precision. The mental map in his head was better than any night vision. 15 degrees east, 20 paces to the old oak. The bikers were 7 yards beyond, behind the steel fence post. You boys getting cold out there? John called softly. He was rewarded by sudden movement, cursing. Might want to put those cigarettes out. Makes you easy to smell downwind. What the hell? The younger voice, startled. How'd he... Shut up, the older one hissed, then louder, false bravado. Just making sure you're safe, old man. Lots of dangerous folks around lately. John smiled without warmth. Indeed there are. For instance, 2 men with concealed weapons loitering on private property. That's dangerous. More movement, a gun being drawn. You're bluffing. You can't see shit. Beretta 92, right side holster, John said calmly. Your friend's carrying something cheaper, Taurus by the rattle. Both loaded, both illegal under state law for men with prior felony convictions. Dead silence followed. Then the older voice, harder now. You've got cameras. No cameras, just good ears. Like right now. I hear your friend's heart rate jumping, nervous about those priors being mentioned. John took 2 precise steps forward. I also hear the slight tremor in your gun hand, wondering how a blind man knows where you are, what you're carrying. A twig snapped as one of them backed up. Shadow growled, low and threatening. Here's what's going to happen, John continued conversationally. You're going to leave. Walk, don't ride, your bikes are disabled. Tell your boss 2 things. First, I know about the Thompson feed store. 3 men, yesterday, strong-arming Bill Thompson for protection money. That stops. You don't know what you're getting into. Old man, the older voice warned. John's next words carried the cold precision of a sniper's focus. Second message, tell him about the Anderson place, 2 counties over. 8 years ago, bike gang tried taking over, disappeared without a trace. Bodies never found. Let him look it up, the younger voice cracked. He's crazy, Mike. Let's... Quiet. But Mike's voice held new uncertainty. One more thing. John raised the hunting rifle, pointing it unerringly at the older man's position. "Next time you watch my farm, I won't warn you first." To demonstrate, he fired once. The bullet sparked off the fence post exactly between the two men. They broke, running. John tracked their panicked flight by sound, noting their direction, their pattern of movement. Shadow pressed against his leg, and John patted the dog's head. "They'll be back," he said quietly, "with more men, more guns, but now they'll be afraid. Fear makes men sloppy." He turned back toward the house, every step measured and sure. The rifle's weight felt familiar in his hands. Not the precision, instrument of his military days, but enough for tonight's message. Inside, he reached for his phone, dialing from memory. The line rang twice. "Sheriff Burke? John Mason. Thought you should know. 2 armed men just fled my property heading north on County Road 23. Both have outstanding warrants if you run Michael Mike Dawson and his known associates." He hung up, settling into his chair. Tomorrow would bring escalation, violence. The bikers wouldn't take this humiliation lightly, but that was tomorrow. Tonight, they'd learned their first lesson. Blindness hadn't made John Mason weak. It had just made him fight differently. The emergency meeting at Thompson's feed store drew every farmer within 20 miles. John sat quietly in the back, Shadow at his feet, listening to the fear in his neighbors' voices. 3 of them came at midnight, Bill Thompson was saying. "Poured sugar in my combine's gas tank. Said next time it'll be worse if I don't sell. Killed 2 of my cattle yesterday." Sarah Wilson's voice shook with anger. "Cut their throats and left them where my kids would find them." John's mental map expanded with each story. The bikers were working a grid pattern, systematically targeting farms in sequence. Professional, military-style tactics poorly disguised as random intimidation. "Sheriff says his hands are tied." Tom Miller spoke up. "No witnesses, no proof. We're on our own." "Not entirely." John's quiet voice cut through the murmurs. The room fell silent. Everyone had heard about his confrontation with the Watchers. "Tell me about their patterns, everything you've noticed." Details poured out. 12 bikes total, moving in groups of 3 or 4. Always the same routes, same times. They were watching school buses, learning where children lived, testing response times from police, building psychological pressure. "They're not just thugs," John said finally. "This is organized, coordinated. Someone's directing them, someone with training." "What do we do?" Sarah Wilson asked. "We can't just give up our farms." John stood, Shadow guiding him to the front. "First we adapt, change routines. Bill, your combine, they knew when and where to hit it. Who knew your harvest schedule?" "Just folks at the grain cooperative." Bill's voice trailed off. "Hell, new buyer there, started last month, kept asking about everyone's equipment. They've got spotters, infiltrators." John nodded. "Second, we coordinate, share information, notice patterns. Tom, those cattle, not random. They waited until your wife was home alone, knew it would hit hardest." The room stirred uneasily. John continued. "They're watching, gathering intelligence, so we watch back. Note bike descriptions, riding patterns, where they fuel up, what they eat, who they talk to. Every detail matters." "And then what?" someone asked. "Then we show them why farming communities survive." John's face hardened. "Because we help each other. Stand together. Some of you served. You know about force multipliers. Every hand that helps is one more problem for them." He laid out his plan. Farmers would work in groups, watching each other's properties. Equipment would be moved, stored randomly. Children would get escorts to school. Every pressure point the bikers were targeting would be systematically reinforced. "But that's not fighting back," Tom protested. "No," John agreed. "That's surviving. Fighting back comes later, when we know their patterns, their weaknesses, when they think they've won." Martha arrived as the meeting ended. Her footsteps hurried. "John, they hit the Anderson place, fire in the barn." The room erupted in angry voices. John raised his hand for silence. "Anyone hurt?" No, Jim got the horses out in time, but they left a message. Spray painted on his house. Blind man can't protect you. John's fingers tightened on his cane. They were escalating faster than expected, trying to isolate him, using his blindness to undermine community confidence. They're wrong, Sarah Wilson said firmly. Meeting at my place tomorrow. We'll set up the watch schedules. As people filed out, John heard their determination replacing fear. Communities were harder to intimidate than individuals, something the bikers hadn't counted on. They'll hit harder now, Martha said softly. Try to break us before we organize. John nodded. That's what I'm counting on. Pride makes them predictable. Tom, got that list of license plates? Better. Tom's voice carried grim satisfaction. Got photos. My boy's been tracking them with his drone. Got faces, locations, meeting spots. Good. John smiled coldly. Time to show them what a blind man really sees. The bikers thought they were breaking the community's spirit. Instead, they were forging it into a weapon, one that a former sniper knew exactly how to aim. John knelt in the soft earth beside the miller's fence line, his fingers reading the ground like braille. 3 bikes stopped here. Recently, soil still compressed, engine heat lingering in the metal fence post. Shadow stood guard while Tom Miller watched in amazement. How can you tell how many? Weight distribution in the tracks. These aren't regular bikers. They park military style, 45-degree angles, ready for quick departure. John's hands moved with precision. One dragged his boot here. Left leg favors the right. Old injury. Detail we can use. They'd been tracking the gang's movement since dawn, building a pattern matrix just like he'd done in combat zones. Every farm hit, every threat made, created a picture invisible to normal eyes, but clear as day to a tactical mind. 4 farms hit yesterday, John continued, standing. Each attack precisely 3 hours apart. They're timing their movements, coordinating teams. Professional. Tom shifted uneasily. Military, you think? Some of them. Leader definitely is. Command structure's too clean for common thugs. John cocked his head, listening. Vehicle approaching. Heavy engine diesel. Gun rack in the back window. That's Jenkins's truck, Tom confirmed moments later as the pickup rounded the bend. How did you... Details, Tom. Always in the details. John turned toward the approaching vehicle. Every engine has a signature. Every weapon makes distinct sounds when it moves. Build enough details, you get truth. Young Tommy Jenkins killed his engine. Mr. Mason, got something you need to hear. Was up in the hills with my drone following them like you asked. They're meeting tonight, all of them, at the old quarry. John's face showed no reaction, but his mind was already calculating. The quarry was perfect. Isolated, good acoustics, multiple escape routes. How many? All 12 bikes. Plus 4 trucks. They're bringing in more men. Tommy's voice dropped. Heard them talking about making examples. Said the blind man's made them look weak. Pride. John nodded. Deadliest weakness in a fighter. Makes them predictable. He turned to Tom. Get word to the others. Tonight's meeting at my place, not Sarah's. Time to show them what a blind man really sees. Back at his farm, John retrieved the case Martha had brought from storage. Inside, his custom rifle components waited alongside specialized equipment. Sound amplifiers, terrain markers, tools of a trade he'd thought finished. You're not really going up against all of them? Martha asked, worry clear in her voice. No. John assembled the rifle by touch, each piece finding its place with practiced ease. Going to let them come to us, but first we set the stage. Throughout the afternoon, farmers arrived in 1s and 2s. John positioned them carefully, using their strengths. Tommy's drone skills, Sarah Wilson's sharp shooting, Bill Thompson's knowledge of local terrain, each became a piece in a larger tactical plan. They'll attack at night, he explained. Thinking darkness gives them advantage. We let them think that. He drew a map in the dirt with his finger, describing terrain features from memory. Each farmer was assigned specific roles, positions, signals, just like coordinating squad movements in combat, but with civilians who had everything to lose. "Remember," he instructed, "we're not soldiers. We're farmers protecting our homes. But that doesn't mean we fight like amateurs." Shadows. Sudden alertness caught his attention. Moments later, others heard it too. Motorcycles, distance, running silent. "Scouts. Right on schedule," John murmured. "They're probing, looking for watchers." His fingers found the rifle's familiar grip. Let them look. Let them think they see everything. The sun was setting, but John Mason didn't need light to know what was coming. Old instincts, honed in combat and preserved through years of darkness, told him everything. The bikers were massing for a show of force, thinking their numbers brought strength. They were about to learn what every enemy he'd ever faced discovered too late. True strength isn't in what you can see, but in what you never notice until it's too late. The message came at midnight, delivered through breaking glass and burning gasoline. The Molotov cocktail crashed through Sarah Wilson's front window, sending her and her children scrambling for safety. Within minutes, 3 more farms were hit, with similar attacks. John heard the chaos unfolding through the emergency radio network they'd established. His fingers traced the tactical map he'd created, reading positions through raised markers and string lines. "Sarah's safe," Martha reported, hanging up the phone. "All families accounted for. No injuries, but 4 houses damaged." "They're getting frustrated," John said quietly, "changing tactics, getting aggressive. Tonight was meant to break us." Shadow's ears perked up seconds before the truck engines became audible. Moments later, vehicles began arriving, farmers and their families, seeking refuge at the Mason farm. "They hit us all at once." Bill Thompson's voice carried barely controlled rage. "Coordinated attacks while their main force was visible at the quarry. Professional diversion." "Exactly." John nodded. "They wanted us to think we knew their plans. Used our own surveillance against us." His hands moved over the map again. "Tommy, that drone footage from their meeting?" "Yes, sir." The boy's voice was tight. "Got it all. 20 new men, heavy weapons. They're not hiding anymore." John's face set in grim lines. "Because they think they've won, think we're broken." He stood, addressing the gathered families. "They're wrong." He laid out what he'd learned from the pattern of attacks. The bikers had revealed their true numbers, their tactics, their level of training. Each act of violence was a piece of intelligence they didn't realize they were giving away. "Look at the timing," he explained. "Attacks came exactly 5 minutes. Apart, moving east to west, military precision. But their radio discipline is sloppy. They're using standard frequencies, no encryption." "What good does knowing that do us?" someone asked. "Everything they've done tells us who they are," John replied. "Ex-military, but not special forces. Regular army, probably infantry. Used to overwhelming force, not subtle tactics. They're following a playbook, one I know very well." Sarah Wilson spoke up, steel in her voice, despite her children huddled close. "So what's their next move?" "Full assault. Tomorrow night, probably. Hit everything at once, make us panic, force quick sales." John's fingers found a specific point on his map. "They'll stage here, at the crossroads, best position to control all approach routes." "How can you be so sure?" Bill Thompson asked. "Because it's what I'd have done before." John's unseeing eyes turned toward the gathered families. "In my other life, when I was the one planning assaults." The room fell silent as his words sank in. They'd all heard rumors about his military service, but this was the first time he'd referenced it directly. "We're not soldiers," Tom Miller said, quietly. "How do we fight military tactics?" "We don't." John's voice carried absolute certainty. "We let them think we can't fight. Let them think tonight broke us. While they're busy feeling confident, we prepare." He began assigning roles, but different from before. Now each task was more specific, more tactical. Farmers who'd served in the military were paired with those who hadn't. Equipment was positioned strategically. Families were moved to secure locations. They see us as scattered, disorganized civilians, he explained. That's our advantage. They'll never expect coordinated resistance. Martha touched his arm. John, this is starting to feel like war. It already is. His face softened slightly. But wars aren't won just by soldiers. They're won by people protecting their homes, their families. We just need to show them why farmers are harder to defeat than armies. The night deepened as plans were made. John could sense the change in the room, fear turning to determination, panic becoming purpose. The bikers had meant to break their spirit. Instead, they'd forged it into something stronger. Tomorrow, he told the gathered families, they'll come expecting to find us cowering, broken. Instead, they'll learn what I learned long ago. The deadliest force isn't the one you can see coming. It's the one you never notice until it's too late. Shadow growled softly, and John turned his face toward the north. In the far distance, motorcycle engines revved in the darkness. A sound meant to intimidate, but to his trained ears, it carried a different message. The breaking point had come, but not for the farmers, for the men who thought violence and terror could defeat a community bound together by something stronger than fear. Shadow's muscles tensed against John's leg exactly 3 seconds before anyone else heard the approaching vehicles. The German Shepherd signal was subtle, a slight shift in pressure, telling John not just that someone was coming, but how many and from which direction. 4 bikes, 2 trucks, John announced to the gathered farmers. Coming in from the northeast access road, trying to move quiet, engines muffled. Tommy Jenkins, up in his makeshift observation post, confirmed 30 seconds later. How do you and Shadow do that, Mr. Mason? Military working dogs don't just detect threats, John explained, his hands moving over his tactical map. They communicate complex information if you learn their language. Shadow was top tier before his handler was killed in Afghanistan. The dog's ears twitched. Another signal. John cocked his head, listening. They're splitting up. Standard. Search pattern. Looking for where we evacuated the families. He and Shadow had spent the pre-dawn hours laying their preparations. Every farm family was safely hidden in the old storm cellars, but they'd left careful evidence suggesting evacuation. To town. The bikers were following the false trail exactly as planned. Second group approaching, Shadow indicated with a subtle head press against John's knee. Larger force, 7 bikes. They're coordinating better today, John noted. Radio disciplines improved. Someone with real experience is directing them now. Martha's footsteps approached, carrying fresh coffee for the observation teams. Sheriff Burke called, said he's got deputies watching the town, but can't spare anyone for out here. Good. John nodded. Better they stay clear of what's coming. Shadow suddenly stiffened, his body language shifting from alert to intense focus. John read the change instantly. Something different, something threatening. Tommy, check the thermal scope. Southeast ridge. Got it. Wait. The boy's voice sharpened. They've got men on foot, military gear, moving tactical. How did... Shadow smelled their weapon oil. Standard military CLP, different from civilian gun oil. John's fingers found the raised markers on his map. They're setting up crossfire positions, professional work. Through the morning, Shadow helped John track every movement, every position. The dog's signals, combined with John's tactical knowledge, painted a clearer picture than any visual surveillance. Could provide. They've got 50 caliber rifles, John announced after Shadow reacted to a distinctive metallic sound. Setting up crew-served weapons. This isn't just intimidation anymore. They're preparing for serious combat. How can we fight that kind of firepower? Bill Thompson asked. John smiled grimly. We don't. We let them deploy everything, commit fully to their positions. Then we show them why overconfidence is dangerous. Shadow's ears flicked forward. Another coded signal. John listened intently. Their commanders hear helicopter coming in low from the west. The sound reached the others moments later, growing from a whisper to a thunder as a black helicopter swept over the tree line, landing at the bikers' staging area. Military surplus Black Hawk, John noted. Civilian registration, probably fake. Shadow range. The dog moved subtly, indicating distance and direction with practiced precision. John's hands found his rifle, fingers checking the modifications he'd made for shooting by sound. Their commander will want to survey our positions before the attack, he explained. Standard tactical procedure. Shadow will track him by scent, giving us their exact command location. You can shoot based just on what Shadow tells you? Tommy asked, incredulous. Shadow was trained to direct precision fire. I was trained to receive targeting data through non-verbal signals. Together, John let the sentence hang. The dog suddenly tensed, communicating multiple threats simultaneously. John translated for the others. They're starting to move. Full assault formation, but they're being sloppy, too confident. He stood, rifle ready but not yet raised. Shadow and I will handle their command element. The rest of you know your positions. Remember, let them think they have the advantage. Martha touched his arm. John, that helicopter pilot, the way it came in, the flight pattern. You know who it is, don't you? John's face hardened. Yes, Shadow recognized his scent too. Colonel James Reed, my former commanding officer. The man who said a blind sniper was worthless to the military. Shadow growled softly, picking up his handler's tension. Seems he's found a new line of work, John continued, using military tactics to terrorize civilians. Time to show him what a worthless blind sniper can do. The dog pressed against his leg, ready, focused, a warrior like his handler. The bikers thought their superior firepower and military training guaranteed victory. They were about to learn that sometimes the deadliest enemies are the ones who don't need eyes to see you coming. The first attack came at dusk, exactly as John had predicted. Two teams of bikers tried infiltrating through the eastern wheat field, using the tall stalks for cover. They moved well, staying low, minimizing noise. But to John's enhanced hearing, they might as well have been marching with drums. 4 men, staggered column formation, he whispered to Tommy, who lay prone beside him with the thermal scope. Leaders favoring his right leg, the one I identified earlier. Second man's carrying something heavy, probably breaching charges. I can barely see them even with the scope, Tommy breathed. How can you? Wheat stalks move differently against tactical gear. Their weapons tap the stems at chest height. Details. John turned his head slightly. Shadow, range. The dog pressed against his leg in a specific pattern. John's hands moved over his rifle, making minute adjustments. Watch and learn, Tommy. Sometimes the best way to stop an attack is to show them. You can see the invisible. John fired twice, the suppressed rifle barely making a sound. 2 wheat stalks severed inches from the lead biker's face, falling across his path. The infiltration team froze. John fired again, cutting stalks progressively, closer to each man's position. Not hitting them, just demonstrating that their exact locations were known. Impossible, one whispered. He can't pull back, the leader hissed. Now, tell Reed the blind man's got electronic detection gear or something. They retreated, trying to move silently but crackling through the wheat like thunder to John's ears. He allowed himself a small smile. Electronic detection gear, Tommy asked. Let them think that, better than accepting a blind man can outshoot them. John's head tilted. Next team's coming. Northwest corner near the old tractor. Throughout the night, John systematically demonstrated skills that seemed impossible. He identified weapon types by their sound signatures, predicted movement patterns by subtle changes in air currents, and placed warning shots with devastating accuracy. They're getting frustrated, he noted after turning back a third probe. Reed's changing tactics. Shadow? The dog's signals confirmed it. The bikers were shifting to more aggressive positions. John nodded grimly. Tommy, get word to the others. They'll try overwhelming force next, multiple directions. How do we stop that? We don't. We let them. Commit fully to the attack. John's fingers found specific points on his tactical map. When they think they've got us surrounded, we show them why that's exactly where we want them. Martha's quiet footsteps approached. John, Sarah Wilson's team reports vehicles moving on the South Road. Lots of them. Good. Reed's taking the bait. John stood, stretching muscles that remembered years of patient waiting in sniper hides. Time to demonstrate some other skills they don't expect. He moved through the darkness with fluid grace, shadow guiding him around obstacles more from habit than necessity. John's mental map was perfect. Every step measured, every position known. They reached the barn just as the bikers began their main deployment. John could track each team by sound, engines, weapons, radio clicks, all following standard military protocols, all completely predictable to someone who'd written some of those protocols. Watch closely, he told Tommy. People think fighting blind would be impossible. Truth is, sight can deceive. Sound, touch, smell, they never lie. To demonstrate, he began calling out positions and armaments for each biker team. 6 men behind the north fence. 3 AR-15s, 2 AKs, 1 designated marksman with a Remington 700. South groups got better weapons, military-issue M4s. Reed's supplying them. Mr. Mason, Tommy said quietly. Exactly what did you do in the military? John's face remained impassive. I helped write the manual on rural terrain warfare, taught special operations teams how to move, fight, and survive in environments like this. His unseeing eyes turned toward the approaching threats. Now I'm going to teach them why those tactics don't work against their creator. Shadow's ears pricked forward. John nodded. Reed's getting impatient, moving his command post closer. A cold smile touched his lips. He never did learn the value of patience. The night deepened as John positioned his people, each farmer with specific instructions. The bikers thought they were executing a sophisticated military operation. In reality, they were walking into a trap designed by a man who'd spent years learning to turn blindness into an advantage. Remember, he told his makeshift defenders, they're expecting farmers with guns. Show them farmers with strategy instead. Thunder rolled in the distance as John made his final preparations. But to his trained senses, an approaching storm wasn't nature's doing. It was the sound of overconfident men riding to their reckoning. The old Mason barn had become a command center. Farmers who'd never imagined fighting anyone now studied tactical maps, coordinated defensive positions, and learned to think like warriors. John stood at the center of it all, turning civilians into a coordinated force. Sarah, your property gives us the high ground. Those hay bales you positioned give perfect cover while looking innocent. His fingers traced the map. Bill, how many tractors did you move? 6. Placed just like you. Said, look broken down, but they'll stop vehicles cold. John nodded. Tom's irrigation pipes create a channel here. Forces them to use predictable routes. His hands kept moving, reading the terrain model they'd built. They're watching us, counting guns, mapping positions, but they're missing what matters. Which is, Martha asked, that we're not defending positions, we're defending homes. John turned toward the assembled farmers. That's what Reed never understood. Military tactics work against military targets. But a community fighting for its existence? That's different. Shadow's ears twitched. John cocked his head. Tommy, check the drone. Got it. They're moving supplies. Big stuff. Gun trucks. Heavy weapons. As expected. John's face showed grim satisfaction. Reed's bringing in everything. Making sure everyone sees his force. Classic psychological warfare. Sarah Wilson spoke up. The children are all secure in the storm cellars. But John, some of the men are having doubts, saying we should give in, protect our families. Tell them to watch what happens next. John moved to the barn door, face turned toward the distant sound of engines. Reed's about to make his show of force. Let everyone see it. Let them feel afraid. Right on cue, the helicopter appeared, flying low over the community. As it passed, doors opened on both sides showing mounted machine guns. A message clearly delivered. 3 passes, John counted. Standard intimidation pattern. Now watch the roads. Vehicle convoys appeared on every approach, engines roaring, weapons visible. The bikers weren't hiding anymore. They wanted to be seen, wanted to inspire terror. Count them, John instructed. Every vehicle, every weapon. Reed wants us to see his strength, so look carefully. The display of force was impressive. The bikers had military-grade weapons, armored vehicles, professional tactical gear. They looked invincible. John smiled. Now, he said quietly, you understand why we'll win. Because they're overconfident, Tommy asked. Because they think hardware equals strength. John turned back to his people. They've shown us everything, every asset, every weapon, no surprises left. He moved through the group, touching shoulders, connecting with each person. You're afraid. Good. Fear keeps you sharp. But remember, they're fighting for money. We're fighting for our homes. Martha's voice carried worry. They have machine guns, John. We have something better. He gestured around the barn. Knowledge. Every ditch, every fence line, every quirk of the land. We know it all. They're fighting on our ground now. The afternoon wore on as John refined their preparations. Each farmer knew their role. Each position was prepared. Not with military fortifications, but with the tools of their trade. Tractors became roadblocks, irrigation ditches became tank traps, hay bales concealed fighting positions. Remember, he instructed, we're not soldiers, we're farmers. Use what you know. Billy, that spot where the creek floods, how deep does it get? 4 feet easy, more when it rains. Perfect. The heavy vehicles will bog down there. Sarah, those old fence posts you never pulled, still got the barbed wire on them, buried in the tall grass? Exactly. They'll never see it until their bikes hit it. John's hands moved over his map again. We're not trying to outfight them. We're going to let the land fight for us. Shadow growled softly. John nodded. They're starting their final preparations. Reed's getting impatient. Once this finished before state police can respond. The gathered farmers shared looks of determination. Fear remained, but something stronger had replaced it. Purpose, unity, the will to protect their own. One last thing, John said quietly. When it starts, remember, they expect panic, chaos. Show them instead what happens when you threaten. A farming community. Martha touched his arm. John, how can you be so calm? His unseeing eyes turned toward the approaching storm of violence. Because I've seen what happens when arrogant men with guns meet determined people protecting their homes. He smiled slightly. The guns always lose. Thunder rolled again, closer now, but the farmers no longer flinched at the sound. They had drawn their lines, prepared their ground, found their courage. The bikers thought they were about to overrun helpless civilians. The helicopter's distinctive sound made Martha freeze. John, that pattern, the way it banks, it's just like Danny's last flight. John's voice was tight. Same pilot, same arrogance. The pieces fell into place as she watched his face. Reed was commanding that mission. The one where my brother died. Yes. John's fingers traced his rifle's stock. Reed ordered them to fly into a hot zone despite weather warnings, said the mission couldn't wait. Shadow pressed against his leg, sensing the old pain. The dog had been there too, part of the quick reaction force that responded to the crash. Danny was Reed's best pilot, John continued. But Reed didn't care. Mission success meant more than soldier safety. Always did. Martha's hand found his shoulder. That's why you requested the transfer to his command afterward? Wanted to watch him. Make sure it didn't happen again. John's unseeing eyes turned toward the sound of the helicopter. But Reed was protected. Too many connections, too much political cover. He walked away clean. Tommy's voice crackled over the radio. "Mr. Mason, got movement at their command post. Someone coming this way under white flag. He wants to talk." John nodded. Now that he knows who he's facing, he'll try manipulation first. "Martha, get the others back to their positions. This conversation needs to be private." The meeting ground was neutral, the crossroads between properties. John stood waiting, shadow alert beside him as boots crunched on gravel. "Captain Mason." Reed's voice carried false warmth. "Or is it just Farmer Mason now, Colonel?" John's face remained impassive. "Still getting good men killed for profit?" Reed's laugh held no humor. "Still bitter about your brother? Danny knew the risks. Combat flying is dangerous." "It was a milk run, supply drop to a secure firebase, until you diverted them into that storm." "Ancient history." Reed's voice hardened. "Let's talk about now. You've impressed me, John. Taking these farmers, turning them into a fighting force, proving you're still tactical despite—" He waved at John's unseeing eyes. "Get to the point. I'm offering you a place. Your skills, my organization. We could do great things." John's head tilted. "Like terrorizing civilians? Stealing farms from families? Like bringing order to chaos? These small farmers, they're obsolete. Big agriculture is the future. We're just accelerating the inevitable. By killing cattle, threatening children." John's voice carried deadly quiet. "That's not acceleration, that's terrorism. It's business." Reed stepped closer. "You're smarter than these dirt farmers, John. You know how the world really works. Power takes what it wants, always has. Like you took Danny's life? For what? A promotion? A pat on the back from your corporate masters?" Reed's patience snapped. "Your brother was weak. He hesitated when I ordered him in. That's what got him killed, his own weakness." John moved so fast, Reed stumbled back. "No, your arrogance killed him. Same arrogance that makes you think you can take these farms. That makes you underestimate dirt farmers because they don't have military training. They have you." Reed's voice dripped contempt. "They're pet blind sniper, but what can you really do, John? You can't even see your targets anymore." John smiled, coldly. "Want a demonstration? That coffee cup in your left hand, ceramic black from the diner in town. The pistol under your jacket is a SIG P226, round-chambered, safety off. And you've got 3 men watching us. 1 in the drainage ditch at your 4 o'clock, 2 in the wheat at your 6. Want me to tell you what they're carrying too?" Reed's sharp intake of breath confirmed every detail. "How?" "I learned to see differently after the explosion that took my sight. Learned to read sounds, smells, vibrations. Learned that eyes can deceive, but other senses never lie." John turned to go. "Take your men and leave. This is your only warning. You're making a mistake." Reed's voice shook with rage. "I've got 30 men, heavy weapons. You've got scared mercenaries fighting for money. I've got farmers fighting for their homes." John paused. "And I've got something else you don't have." "What's that?" "Justice." John's voice carried absolute certainty. "Danny's justice, the justice you escaped last time. Tell your men what's coming. Tell them they're not just fighting farmers. They're fighting my brother's memory." He walked away, shadow guiding him through terrain he knew by heart. Behind him, Reed stood silent, finally understanding what he'd awakened. This wasn't just about farms anymore. This was about blood, about debts long unpaid, about a brother's final flight and the man who ordered him to his death. The storm was coming, and this time there would be nowhere for Reed to hide. Reed's first attack came at midnight, using night vision and infrared equipment. His men moved with practiced stealth, confident that darkness would give them advantage over defenders, especially a blind one. John sat in his rocking chair, listening to their approach. "Tommy, cut the power to the farm, all of it." Seconds later, the landscape plunged into absolute darkness. The bikers paused, adjusting their night vision gear. That's when John began his demonstration. "First lesson," he said softly to Martha, who stood nearby. Their equipment blinds them to natural sound. His rifle cracked 3 times. 3 night vision goggles shattered. "What the hell?" a voice hissed in the darkness. "How can he—" "Your gear makes noise," John called out. "Electronic whine. Different pitch for night vision versus thermal. Tells me exactly where you are, what you're using. More shots. More shattered equipment." The bikers' professional formation began to break. "Second lesson," John continued calmly. "Darkness isn't cover. Not when you can hear heartbeats, smell gun oil, feel vibrations through the ground." Shadow pressed against his leg, signaling new movements. John adjusted his position slightly. "That flanking maneuver you're attempting?" His voice carried across. "The darkness. I can tell by your footsteps you're using standard military pattern. Predictable, especially when you're stepping on dry leaves at your 2 o'clock. The flanking team froze. John's rifle spoke again, bullets sparking off metal, inches from their positions. "Impossible," someone shouted. "He can't—" "Can't what?" John asked. "Can't fight because I'm blind. Your night vision shows heat signatures. My hearing picks up your pulse, your breathing, the whisper of fabric when you move. Which of us is really blind?" Reed's voice crackled over their radios. "He's got some kind of detection system. Electronic countermeasures. Find it." John smiled coldly. "No electronics, Reed. Just skills you helped me develop. Remember those enhanced awareness courses you sent me to? Learning to fight without visual cues? Didn't expect me to master it quite this well, did you?" To demonstrate, he began calling out their positions one by one. "Sniper team on the ridge. Your scope's battery is running low. Makes a distinctive whine. Demolition team by the barn. Your fresh soap smell. Recently cleaned. Assault team trying to crawl through the wheat. Your web gear is scratching the stalks at precisely chest height." The biker's confidence crumbled as John systematically proved that darkness meant nothing to him. Every movement they made, every position they took was instantly exposed. Getting frustrated, John taunted, "Wondering how a blind man can track you better than your expensive equipment. Simple. You rely on technology. I rely on truth." Martha touched his arm. "They're pulling back." "No," John corrected. "They're regrouping. Reed's realizing his night attack failed. He'll switch tactics, probably try overwhelming force next. But first—" His rifle cracked one more time. The bullet struck Reed's command vehicle, precisely where the antenna mounted. "That's their communications gone," John explained. "Reed always did hate radio discipline. Uses the same frequencies he did in the military." The bikers retreated into the darkness, but John tracked every movement. "They'll be back. Daylight assault next. Reed will think removing the cover of darkness works in his favor." "Doesn't it?" Tommy asked, rejoining them. "No, because now they're scared, questioning everything they thought they knew about fighting. A blind man." John's hands moved over his rifle, checking it by touch. "Fear makes men sloppy, makes them rush, and rushing gets you killed." Shadow's ears pricked forward. John nodded. "They're at their fallback position, arguing. Some want to quit. They didn't sign up to fight someone who sees better in darkness than they do with night vision." "But Reed won't let them quit," Martha said quietly. "No, his pride won't allow it. Especially not after I reminded him about Danny." John's face hardened. "He'll push them to attack again. Harder this time. Desperate. Can we stop them?" "We already are." John smiled slightly. "Every failed attack, every exposed position, every shattered piece of equipment, it all proves that their advantages are illusions. Just like thinking a blind man can't fight." In the distance, engines roared as the bikers withdrew, but John heard what others missed, the subtle changes in tone that meant they were already preparing their next assault. "Get some rest," he told his people. "Tomorrow they'll come with everything they have, and we'll show them why true sight has nothing to do with eyes." The afternoon before the final battle unfolded like a military operation. John moved through the community, checking preparations, his fingers reading the land's readiness like braille. Irrigation ditches are flooded, Bill Thompson reported. 2 feet deep, just like you asked. Looks normal, but it'll bog down their vehicles. Hay bales? John asked, hands testing the density of one stack, exactly where you wanted them. Look random, but they'll stop bullets better than sandbags. John nodded. His enhanced hearing picked up the distant sound of Reed's forces gathering. They're staging in 3 groups. Larger than before, Reed's called in everything he has. Shadows, subtle signals confirmed more details. John translated for the others. 50 men now, heavy weapons. They've got gun trucks, probably stolen military surplus. Reed's not pretending anymore. This is a full tactical assault. Martha approached, her footsteps carrying tension. State police finally called back, said they can't get here until morning. Something about roadblocks, their units being diverted. Reed's got people in law enforcement, John explained. He's isolating us, making sure no help comes until it's too late. His fingers traced his tactical map. That's fine, we're ready. Throughout the day, he refined their defenses, not with military fortifications, but with a farmer's knowledge of the land. Old tractors were positioned to create choke points. Irrigation pipes became tank traps. Every natural feature became a weapon. Tommy, John called. Those drone pictures you took, what do you see in their staging area? They're getting ready for war, Mr. Mason. Body armor, assault rifles, even some machine guns on tripods. Good. They're committed now. No way to hide this as just business anymore. John's face showed grim satisfaction. When this is over, Reed's corporate backers will abandon him. Can't risk being connected to something this blatant. Sarah Wilson arrived with more news. They're telling their men, we've got some kind of high-tech security system. That's how you've been stopping them. John smiled coldly. Let them think that. Better than admitting they're being outfought by a blind man and some farmers. As evening approached, he gathered everyone for final instructions. Each position was checked, every role confirmed. They weren't soldiers, but they'd learned to fight like something more dangerous, people protecting their homes. Remember, he told them, Reed expects military resistance. He's prepared for that. What he doesn't understand is that farming itself is a kind of warfare. Against weather, against time, against the land itself. Use that knowledge. Shadow's ears suddenly pricked forward. John cocked his head, listening. Their first units are moving. Support weapons teams, setting up firing positions. How? Tommy began, then caught himself. Right. You can hear their equipment. More than that. Feel it through the ground. Heavy tripods being set up. Smell their gun oil, military grade, different from civilian. Details matter in combat. The sun began to set, painting the valley in colors John could no longer see, but remembered perfectly. His hands moved over his rifle one last time, checking each modification by touch. Martha, he said quietly, get everyone to their positions. When this starts, it's going to happen fast. John, her voice carried worry. Reed's not going to stop, is he? Not even if we beat them tonight. No, that's why tonight has to be decisive. His unseeing eyes turned toward the gathering threats. Reed's built his reputation on never losing, on being invincible. Tonight we don't just stop his attack, we destroy that reputation completely. Shadow growled softly as more vehicles approached. John nodded. They're all in position now. Reed's got his forces exactly where he wants them. A cold smile touched his lips. Exactly where we want them to. The light faded, but darkness meant nothing to John Mason. He'd learned to see truth that eyes could miss, to read battlefield signs that vision would overlook. Tonight, that knowledge would teach Reed and his men the deadliest lesson of all. The true sight has nothing to do with eyes. It's time, he told his people. Remember, Let them think their superior numbers and weapons make them strong. We'll show them why a farmer's connection to his land is stronger than any military training." Night fell over the valley like a closing fist. But in the darkness, John Mason could see everything. The attack began with a roar of engines and gunfire. 50 men armed with military weapons charged forward in a coordinated assault that would have overwhelmed any normal defense. Vehicles powered through fences while gunners laid down suppressing a fire. But John had been waiting for this moment. He stood absolutely still, reading the battlefield through sound and vibration. "First groups hit the irrigation ditch," he announced calmly. 3 vehicles trapped, second groups turning to avoid them, right into the hay bales. The night erupted in chaos as Reed's carefully planned assault ran headlong into farming. Knowledge turned to tactical advantage. Heavy gun trucks bogged down in strategically flooded fields. Motorcycles hit hidden wire between hay bales. Every escape route led to another trap. "They're splitting up," John called over the radio network. "Just like we planned. Sarah, your team is up." From concealed positions, farmers who'd spent lifetimes shooting varmints demonstrated their skill, not killing shots. John had been explicit about that. But precise fire that disabled weapons, punctured gas tanks, forced Reed's men to abandon their vehicles. "Boss, we're getting slaughtered," someone shouted over the gang's radio frequency. "They're everywhere." "Push through!" Reed's voice cracked with fury. "They're just farmers." John smiled coldly. "Tommy, hit the lights." Powerful floodlights, normally used for night harvesting, blazed to life. Strategically positioned, they blinded the attackers while leaving the defenders in shadow. Reed's men found themselves caught in killing zones of light, unable to see the threats around them. "Now you know how it feels," John broadcast on their frequency, "to be blind in a fight. Difference is, I've learned to use it." Shadow's signal warned him of flanking movement. John's rifle spoke 3 times, disabling the night vision equipment of Reed's elite team trying to circle behind the defensive positions. "Their formation's breaking," Martha reported. "Some of them are running." "No!" Reed's voice carried rage and desperation. "Stand and fight. He's just one blind man." "Tell them what you see, Tommy," John instructed. The boy's voice carried across all frequencies. "Got 30 men down or retreating. 6 vehicles disabled. Your whole eastern flank is collapsed." John moved to his next position, every step perfect in terrain he knew by heart. "Your men are scared, Reed. They should be. You trained them to fight soldiers, but we're not soldiers. We're farmers. This land doesn't just feed us, it fights for us." As if proving his point, more vehicles bogged down in hidden mud pits. Men who tried to advance on foot found themselves tangled in agricultural netting, exposed to precise fire from defenders who'd spent lifetimes learning to shoot straight. "Getting frustrated," John taunted as another attack failed, "wondering how a blind man and some farmers are beating your tactical expertise? Simple. You see what you expect, threats in front of you. I see everything, because I don't use eyes. To fight, the helicopter's distinctive sound approached. John tracked it by ear, noting the subtle changes in the rotor pitch. "Coming to join the fight personally, Reed." "Good. Time we finished what started with Danny's last flight." Shadow's warning came just as Reed's remaining forces launched their biggest push. 3 teams, converging from different directions, laying down heavy fire. "All units, fall back to secondary positions," John ordered calmly. "Let them think they're winning." Defenders retreated in careful sequence, drawing Reed's men deeper into prepared killing grounds. Each step of apparent victory was actually a carefully planned trap. "They're following," Tommy reported from his observation post, "taking all the bait." John nodded, his unseeing eyes turned toward the approaching sounds of what Reed thought was triumph. "Good. Let them come. Time to show them why you don't threaten a farming community." The night thundered with gunfire and engines, but to John's trained senses, it was all just information. Every sound, every vibration, every shift in the air told him exactly what was happening. Reed thought superior firepower would guarantee Victory. He was about to learn why some battles can't be won with guns. Reed's forces had walked right into John's trap. Their vehicles were scattered across the farmland, disabled by precise shots and careful preparation. His men were pinned down, caught between flooded ditches and targeted fire from farmers who knew every inch of their land. "Status report," John called over the radio network. "West Group contained," Sarah responded. "They're not going anywhere." "East side secured," Bill Thompson added. "Got 8 of them trapped in the old grain silo." John nodded, tracking the helicopters. Sound. Reed was getting desperate, flying lower, taking risks, just like the night Danny died. "He's going to try something stupid," John told Martha. "His pride won't let him lose to a blind man." Shadow's muscles tensed against his leg. The dog's signal was clear. Reed was landing. "All units hold position," John ordered. "This ends." Between me and him, the helicopter touched down in the central pasture. John counted footsteps as Reed approached. 4 men with him, heavy weapons. "Quite an operation you've got here, Mason," Reed shouted. "But it's over. Surrender now. Nobody else gets hurt." John stood, rifle ready but not raised. "Like Danny, was he supposed to not get hurt too?" "Still crying about your brother?" Reed's voice dripped contempt. "He was weak. Hesitated when it mattered." "He hesitated because it was the right call. Storm was too heavy, mission wasn't critical." John's voice carried deadly calm. "But you couldn't accept that. Your perfect record mattered more than his life." Reed's men were spreading out, trying to flank. John tracked each movement by sound. "The man on your left is limping. Caught in our wire earlier," John said conversationally. "One behind you is breathing heavy. Probably cracked ribs from the fall in the irrigation ditch. The 2 on the right, they're afraid. Hearts beating too fast, hands shaking on their weapons." "Shut up," Reed raised his rifle. "You're not mystic or superhuman. You're just a broken soldier playing at being special." "No, Reed, I'm what you created. Every enhanced combat sense course, every special operations training. I learned it all, then losing my sight made me perfect it." John smiled coldly. "Want a demonstration?" His rifle snapped up and fired 4 times. 4 weapons clattered. To the ground, their firing mechanisms shattered. Reed's men broke, running. John let them go. "Just you and me now," John said quietly. "Like it should be." "I've still got the gun." Reed's voice shook slightly. "And you're still blind." "Am I?" John took a step forward. "Your safety's off, round-chambered. M4 carbine, modified with that custom trigger you always preferred. 30-round magazine, but you fired 12 times tonight. 18 rounds left." Reed's breathing hitched. "How? I can hear your pulse racing, smell your fear, feel your boot scuffs in the dirt as you take half steps backward." John advanced steadily. "You're not fighting a blind man, Reed. You're fighting every lesson you ever taught me, perfected by darkness." "Stay back," Reed fired, the shot going wide. 17 rounds, John counted. "Your hands are shaking, just like Danny said they did when you ordered him into that storm. Right before you got him killed. He died because he was weak. He died because you were wrong." John's voice cracked like thunder. "But you couldn't admit it, couldn't let your record show a failed mission. So you blamed him, covered it up, moved on to another command. More shots, all missing. 14 rounds, John said calmly. "Want to know what Danny's last words were? The ones you left out of the report?" Reed fired. Again, emptying his magazine in panic. John never flinched as bullets whipped past. He said, "The colonel's wrong. Sometimes standing down is braver than pushing forward." John's rifle came up. "Danny died because you couldn't accept being wrong. Today, you're wrong again." The shot was perfect, just like the ones that had made him the military's deadliest. Sniper. Reed's weapon shattered in his hands. "I won't kill you," John said as Reed fell backward. "Danny wouldn't want that. But you're finished. Your men have run, your operations exposed, and everyone will know you were beaten by a blind farmer and his neighbors." Police sirens wailed in the distance. Shadow pressed against John's leg, their signal for approaching. Vehicles, state police coming, Martha called out. Lots of them, John nodded. Perfect timing. Reed's corporate backers can't hide this now. Too many witnesses, too much evidence. This isn't over, Reed snarled, but his voice held no conviction. It was over the moment you threatened my community. John turned away. Danny died protecting people. Today I honored his memory by doing the same. The difference is, I lived to make sure you finally faced justice. As police vehicles surrounded the farm, John stood quietly with Shadow at his side. He couldn't see the sunrise breaking over his land, but he could feel its warmth. More importantly, he could hear the sounds of his community emerging from there. Defensive positions, proud, undefeated, stronger for having stood together. Reed had brought military might against simple farmers, but he'd learned too late that true strength isn't about weapons or tactics. It's about having something worth fighting for and being willing to defend it at any cost. The morning after the battle, the farming community gathered at Thompson's feed store. State police were still processing evidence at multiple farms, documenting the remarkable defense that had stopped a private military force. John sat quietly, Shadow at his feet, listening to his neighbors share their stories. Every farmer had played a crucial role. Every piece of land had become part of their victory. FBI's involved now, Sheriff Burke reported. Reed's corporate connections are unraveling. Fast. Seems his backers don't appreciate their land grab making national news. They found Danny's real flight recorder, Martha added softly. The one Reed claimed was destroyed. All these years, and finally the truth comes out. John nodded, his unseeing eyes turned toward the morning sun he could feel on his face. Danny would have liked how it ended, not with revenge, but with community. The door chimed as Sarah Wilson entered. Just heard from the State Farming Commission. They're implementing new protective regulations. Seems our stand here exposed. A whole network of corporate land seizures. More importantly, Tom Miller added, nobody's going to think twice about messing with farming communities after this. Not when they hear how a bunch of farmers and one blind man took down a private army. John smiled slightly. We won because we fought together, used what we knew, turned our supposed weaknesses into strength. Tommy Jenkins spoke up from where he was serving coffee. Mr. Mason, some of us were wondering, would you consider teaching us? Not just about defense, but about really using our senses, knowing the land better? Whole communities interested, Bill Thompson confirmed. We've learned there's more to farming than just working the soil. It's about truly understanding our land. John considered this, his fingers running over the worn wood of his coffee cup. Might be a good idea. World's changing. Farmers need to change too, not by giving up our way of life, but by getting better at protecting it. Martha touched his shoulder. Danny would be proud, you know. Not just of how you got justice for him, but of what you've built here. Built together, John corrected. Reed never understood that. Thought superior force was everything. But he was fighting more than farmers with guns. He was fighting generations of connection to the land. That's something no tactical training can match. Shadow's ears pricked forward as more vehicles approached. Media this time, drawn by the story of how a rural community had defended itself. They'll want interviews, Sheriff Burke warned. Let the others handle that, John said, standing. Shadow and I have rounds to make. Farm doesn't stop needing attention just because we had to fight for it. As he walked home, John listened to his community coming back to life. Tractors rumbling in fields, children playing without fear, neighbors calling greetings. But there was something new in their voices. Pride, confidence, the strength of people who had stood together and won. You know what, boy, he said to Shadow as they reached his porch. Sometimes you have to lose something to gain something stronger. I lost my sight, but found a clearer way of seeing. These farmers lost their sense of safety, but found their collective strength. The morning sun warmed his face as John Mason, blind farmer and former sniper, settled into his rocking chair. His community was safer now, stronger for having faced this test, and somewhere, he knew, Danny was smiling. Reed had brought an army to break them. Instead, he'd forced them to discover just how unbreakable they truly were.